Breakout was really early. Yeah, it's a ball and paddle game, right? And it was brilliant idea for Nolan to do that. I mean, he had a lot of ideas, and he was the guy that went around me and corralled Jobs into designing this, not knowing that Jobs wasn't an engineer and couldn't do that. And Jobs wasn't about to tell him, but his buddy was, who was just the sweetest, brightest savant. And I come in and Steve Jobs says, hey, look at this. And here is a finished game, Breakout, that was not under development. Understand, typical games took a few months to develop. It was like, got dropped in from outer space, finished game, working prototype. What? And Jobs says, yeah, he claimed he designed it. And I go, no, he didn't, bullshit. And I found out later that because Woz was coming in at night, he's working at HP, and he liked HP, but Atari was a lot more fun. So I go in and there's a finished game. I'm going, what the f? This is crazy. You heard the story. I'll tell you my version because I've seen some different numbers, but as I understand it, Nolan said he would give Jobs a bonus of $1,000 a chip for every chip less than 50 that he was able to do this with. Now, knowing that this had more objects and stuff than Pong did, and Pong was 76 chips, it's a pretty safe bet that Nolan's not gonna have to pay a penny for this, right? Again, Woz is one of the most gifted, brilliant men engineering. Woz designs it with like 24 chips. Now, Nolan didn't say you had to be able to buy the chips. So some of the chips were chips out of Hewlett-Packard that you couldn't get. But there was the prototype of the working game. And you look at a schematic and I couldn't understand, how would this thing work?
Vectors are amazing things, right? Like the fact that vector graphics were phenomenal, and they continue to hold up really well. So I think when we look at Tempest or Tempest 2000 or Tempest 4000, I feel like those games, of all of the games, those old games, have aged the best. Not Tempest specifically, but the vector-based games, and Tempest just being a really incredibly strong example of a vector-based game because it still looks beautiful.
Aesthetically, I just think Tempest is a timeless game. Asteroids is a timeless game.
The old CRTs, the cathode ray tubes, had a beam that would go across the screen very fast, and it would draw the line. So you drew that always. So that was always being drawn, and you could turn on and off the beam, or beams if it's color, red, green, blue in color, and create an image. Vector doesn't do that. Vector, you actually draw the lines. So there is no raster going on. The beam isn't doing this down the screen. If you want to draw a red line that goes like that, you put the beam there and you push it across the screen to there. So you are actually doing an Etch-a-Sketch is the best way to think about it.
One of the interesting limitations and why it's so good for space games on Vector is if you don't draw something, the screen is black. It's not kind of sort of gray, it's black.
If the hardware stopped in a coin-op game, the last picture would stay there. If hardware stops in a vector generator, it goes black because you have to draw it. You're drawing the beams. There's no raster. There's nothing automatic in that. And I like that as well. That meant I could draw something and I didn't have to worry about it again. If I wanted to move it, I just redrew it over here. Before, you have to erase it from that space and rewrite it over here. Yeah, didn't like that. Too much work.
The limitation isn't how many dots you have, it's how many inches of light you have. And a lot of people really love that white on black look.
You could get these really fine details for the time. I mean, if you go back and look at it now, it's not as high res as you think it is, but the ships and the shots and the way it looked, and you could adjust the brightness on an individual item, that bright shot in Asteroids, for example, and that goes across the screen. There's nothing like that. It's just an amazing look, and I wanted to work on it.
We started with black and white. I worked a little bit on Battlezone when I worked on the simulator, which was after Battlezone came out, but if you remember Battlezone, it was green. Those weren't green lines, that was a green template that was over the top that made it green.
I got color when I did Space Duel, which I took over from another programmer who, for some reason, just kind of lost it and left the company and kind of evolved it from what he had started. I wanted more time to work on it, and another programmer was working on Asteroids Deluxe, and I was doing color asteroids. That's what I was doing with it. That's what Space Duel originally started, as color asteroids. And they said, oh, we're not going to do that because Asteroids Deluxe just came out. So they gave the hardware and some of the code I did to Dave Toyer, and he did Tempest. And then some of that came back, and I did Space Duel. So you'll see things that are similar that cross through it.
So Vector Sector was born out of the idea of what if all of Atari's vector games existed in the same universe? And we went from there. It was great to talk to Owen Rubin, who created Major Havoc, Space Duel. And when he played Vector Sector, he got through the asteroids phase and he got to Lunar Lander, and he was like, oh, you should do this with linked ships. And he didn't know that we'd done that. So that was like a thrill. Also, when we got to the end of the game, we played a linked dual multiplayer game. We got to the end, and he was having a conversation with me. He glanced up and he saw that we had his initials in the high scores as a default high score. And he just threw out a, oh, thanks. Yeah, thought that was cool.
Well, at the beginning, it was sort of forbidden to consort with the enemy.
First off, we had a vibrant coin-op business that was making money and keeping us in business, and consumer wasn't making anything. I didn't want to screw with that. I did not want to damage that.
There was a door that said, "Don't even think about entering here." And I was like, I work for this company. I opened the door and walked in, and Al turned around and goes, "What are you doing in here? Who the hell are you? Why are you here?" And so I said, "Well, I work for this company. What are you guys doing?"
Oh, and found out how to open the door between the two places. And what's this? And I'm going, "What the hell are you doing?" Anyway, we became friends.
I was one of the few people in CoinOp that spent a lot of time in the consumer group, sort of going back and forth.
I believe that Al Alcorn was sincerely concerned that CoinOp would be a distraction on his group, which we're doing a very ambitious project on a very tight schedule.
Other companies like Bally all of a sudden took some of their engineers in CoinOp, and first off, I didn't think these were the right kind of engineers to do consumer. It's a different cost accounting, a different culture. Number two, I didn't want to screw with CoinOp's success.
The arcade games were pretty much in one area, and the consumer people were in another area.
Engineering was upstairs for consumer products. We were downstairs, and I only knew a few of them, you know, and it was because we water skied together.
There really was two separate companies, it felt like, at a time. They had very different development environment. There was no synergy between the two, really, other than that we shared games.
I have been known to joke that the point of CoinOp games is primarily selling players their own adrenaline. So you want an intense, fast-pitch game, and you'll blame yourself if it's over in 3 minutes, not the game. A person who pays 20, 30, 40, 50 bucks for a cartridge wants to milk that thing. So the games themselves are different.
Every machine is state of the art. It's all new, fresh, challenging stuff, and it's exciting, and it's real design.
CoinOp gets to use more expensive hardware. They get to use tons and tons of hardware, and they get to refresh their hardware all the time, right? So what's happening is the Atari 2600 chip, the 6502, is a chip you could make in '76. Now Moore's Law is cruising along, doubling computer power every 3 years, but we're using a chip from '76.
Every couple of years, the console would come out, and Atari just had to live with the old technology, but fortunately with programmers figuring out new ways to use it.
But for me, there was no rivalry. It was, they made games and they were interesting ideas, and a lot of them we were going to have to try and copy.
What happened, though, was as the VCS really started to make distribution and really started to get out there, and some games really started to catch on, it became apparent that the profit potential from the home games was actually much higher than it was in CoinOp. So I'll tell you another pecking order sign that goes on, which raises a lot of interesting things, both financially and emotionally, is the idea of royalties. Because one big difference between VCS and CoinOp was CoinOp people got royalties. They got some kind of bonus participation in the success of their games, which VCS people didn't. That got to be a sore point, not between CoinOp and engineering, but between VCS and management. And it's like, why aren't we doing that?
Atari had a bonus plan that was based on how your game sold. And then the consumer group wanted their own bonus plan based on how their game sold. So they would take a game designed by the CoinOp that was in the arcade, they'd make a 2600 cartridge out of it, it would do really well, they get big bonuses, and we weren't included at all. So there was this kind of like, wait a minute, why are they taking our ideas and we're not included? That was resolved later.
Everybody, you know, identifies as the hero of their own narrative. You know, when you start checking the narratives against each other, that's when you find some interesting differences. And it wasn't, I never felt that CoinOp people lorded over us, and I don't think we felt like second-class citizens, but it was well known that CoinOp was working on hotter technology, doing cooler stuff, and we were trying to keep up with a technology that was falling farther and farther and farther behind. That's just the reality of it.
They both needed each other, and that's the way most of us looked at it. It was a collaboration, not a competition.
My name is Evelyn Cito. I was a graphic designer at Atari, both in the coin-operated division and the consumer division. I majored in graphic design while I was in college, and when I finished, I went back to LA and helped in my family's business, which was a restaurant business. And when I returned, a friend of mine was working at Opera in Harrington, and she was moving on to another position. And so she had me interview with George Opperman, and I was able to come on board on his staff as a production artist. During that time, which is when I started with George, it was the early 70s, and Silicon Valley was just barely a term that was barely coming up. Nolan Bushnell had his company Syzygy, a gaming company, and he needed to change the name of the company. George Farraco, one of his colleagues, suggested that he speak to George Opperman. So I remember them coming in, and George he took on the assignment of redesigning the logo for Syzygy. And they gave him the name Atari. And so, I remember George doodling on his desk. Yeah, he was just doing little doodles, and from there, he maybe selected a few of them to show Nolan, and they picked the one that they did, which is the one with the Fuji and the Atari. And back then, everything was done by hand. There was no computers. Everything was you had to ink, and you had to spec type and order type, and then paste it all up on a board. So yeah, everything was kind of handcrafted back then. And so yeah, that was my first position, was with George doing production art. And so once they decided on which one they were going to do, I got the assignment of ordering the type and inking the Fuji. So that was my first jobs in working with Atari, was to ink that Fuji. Nolan liked names that started with A's because they were at the front of the alphabet. And because also at the time Pong was our main product, the main product. Now George says he liked the idea of it sweeping because the Pong blip would sweep, right? So that's George's. There are people who attribute that to George. George Farraco doesn't believe that was true. But so I honestly don't know where it came from, because obviously he didn't tell me. He just said, "Here, ink this up." So part of it is probably an A, and part of it is the sweep. It's probably all of that could be true. So whatever it was, it's definitely stood the test of time. And he picked the hairy type font for the Atari, and I think that's actually stood the test of time as well. Shortly after that, I left George, so that was like in '71, and I left in '72, and so George probably continued working with Atari at the time. I had moved on to another company, and in 1976, George called me and asked me, told me he was giving up his company, and he was going to go inside at Atari and become their full-time art director. And he needed an assistant, and asked me if I would be interested in doing that. I kind of thought of it as a placeholder, actually. I wasn't sure how long I would do this, and not being that familiar with the company. But anyway, I said, okay, So we were in this little cubby hole. Our two desks were facing each other, And basically we had a drawing board each, and George was doing all the graphics and all the advertising and whatever that was required. George himself was an illustrator as well as a designer, as well as a marketing guy, as well as a copywriter. So he would write all the copy, and he would write all the promotional materials for Atari. So he was an in-house advertising agency. Because I wasn't an illustrator, so the things that didn't require illustration, I would work on some of those, or I would collaborate with one of the illustrators. I might come up with a concept, and then one of the illustrators would design the graphic for me, like in Superbug or in Golf. Bob Flamani was the artist on those particular pieces, and so, but the concept of how it looked, the general concept might be mine, but then I would basically have the illustrator do it, which is not unusual because a lot of graphic designers are not illustrators. I worked on Superbug, I worked on Fire Truck, which was a two-man game. And see, because those graphics I could deal with, they weren't, it didn't require me to illustrate a person or an animal, so I could do graphic things, but I wasn't able to do illustrations. And I did do football, and or the soccer game that was created from that. And then when Atari got into pinball, I worked on a concept for the Wonder Woman pinball game, and that didn't require me to be such an conceptual illustrator because I already had reference material to work with in terms of the comic series. And so eventually we grew to a staff of about eight people. And we had a production artist, but George was still doing all the advertising and the brochures and all the marketing materials for any of the games that came up. And so eventually the company grew, and I stayed there for a couple of years, and ultimately decided that I had an opportunity to go. In 1977, Atari was already working on the consumer video game system. And I had heard about it but didn't know a whole lot about it. I got asked if I would like to join the consumer group. And so I went ahead and did that. And that's where I felt at home because then I can focus on graphic design more than illustration. That was a great opportunity for me to really focus on branding. They were starting to introduce some other game systems, and so they wanted to figure out how to market it, and we wanted to take a look at what kind of packaging design do we want to go with, because at the time the VCS system was a black background with little vignettes of game players and parents and screen grabs of some of the video games. And so we decided to take a look at what we could do with it. The video computer system was sort of a generic name, and so we decided to maybe focus on blowing up the name Atari. So we made some mock-ups to do that. Basically, on a product shelf, you got 3 seconds to grab somebody's attention. We banded the box with Atari with the number of the game system, and we created some packaging and took it to a store to see how it would stand up next to the competition. And at the time, Odyssey was out, Magnavox, Coleco, there were other game systems out there, and they were similar in design to what we had already created. So we took it to a store and took some photographs, and with the other competition in the background, it was clear that the Atari, branding big was the way to go. Yeah, it's like, hello, why didn't we think of that sooner? But obviously somebody didn't think of it before we did. And then at the same time, I think Star Wars came out, and so we thought, well, gee, the space age was coming about. And so maybe we should look at, maybe color isn't the way to go. So they wanted to see what else we could do to make it look more space agey. So we came up with the silver concept of the packaging, and ultimately that's the way we went. At the time, our cartridge boxes were all real colorful and rainbow. The rainbow stripes seemed to be sophisticated enough and give it some color. And so from that, I thought it went underneath the silver band on all the boxes, so it seemed to work for that. And I think that was sort of a nod to the fact that, okay, we still have, the rainbow was sort of a nod to all the color boxes. The Fuji's always stayed there, and I think the typefaces always stay there. Although some people have played around with the typeface a little bit, but you know, you can't change it. It looks, it's a classic.
Chicken, fight like a robot. Chicken, fight like a robot. Humanoid. Martha.
The main theme of Berserk, as I understand it, and as I've always understood it, is basically you're one of the last humans trying to escape this prison inhabited by robots. Because there's this character in the game called Evil Otto, and he bounces at you with this smiley face, but it's so sinister because all he's really trying to do is just pulverize you to like nothing. And he comes at you so aggressively. Even back in the day, the story got around really fast that somebody died playing Berserk.
The rumblings of rumors when it got out, like, oh my gosh, someone died while playing Berserk. They must have, I don't know if the game shot back at them, I don't know what happened.
And I think that added to the mystique of the game, because could this game kill you? But in reality, as far as I understand, it was somebody who actually had a heart condition who happened to be playing Berserk when an episode occurred, but that of course got embellished to this game will kill you.
I remember Berserk coming out for the 2600 and I was very impressed. The characters were very simple, but moved exactly like the arcade. The gameplay was great. I thought it was one of the great Atari cartridges, up there with Space Invaders in that time frame of arcade ports.
One of my favorite games on the 2600 happened to be Berserk. I thought it was really well produced. It didn't look like other Atari games where they flickered a lot. The characters were really solid, everything looked great, and it was a really great representation of the arcade game.
Yeah, the gameplay was well tweaked, which is not given the credibility that it should. The amount of tweaking that gameplay requires to make an excellent game, to make a truly great game, it's unappreciated.
Oh my God,
yeah.
Is it?
When I was learning, or basically teaching myself how to program the Atari 2600, as one does, I started to dabble with audio, and I had seen somebody had replicated synthesized voice on the 2600. And so that kind of occurred to me that it would be really cool to take that approach and that concept and apply it to Berserk to have the perfect version of Berserk for the Atari 2600. That set in motion my desire to just like pursue relentlessly putting voice into 2600 Berserk. And then my understanding of the arcade game is there's a specific speech synthesis chip that was used for the game. And to compare that to the 2600, there's no such thing on the 2600. And so in order to get speech to even sound similar to that chip, you have to apply all of Atari 2600's resources to it. So in order to get the sample to play back fast enough, you have to do things like don't display the screen. So the screen goes black so you can get a cleaner and more audible sound out of the processor, the sound processor. Some of the changes that I had applied to the game early on were mostly palette related and some graphical changes. Also added a title screen. I always felt that like later Atari 2600 games that had title screens were really cool, so I wanted this to feel like those. But ultimately that was where my work ended. But then the community hopped in after that release, and Dennis DeBro particularly found out by disassembling the game that there was actually code for the robots to shoot diagonally like in the arcade game. I found it fascinating that after I dabbled a little bit with Berserk, to watch other people go in and find all these other things within the source code that I missed completely, and started to apply that to like what would become ultimately Berserk Voice Enhanced.
Robot. Humanoid monopathy. Humanoid monopathy. Humanoid monopathy. Humanoid monopathy. Humanoid monopathy. Humanoid monopathy. Humanoid monopathy.
So I started collecting on the 2600 when I was working at Looking Glass in Cambridge, Massachusetts, with Rex Bradford, who had actually worked for Activision and Parker Brothers back in the day. And that inspired me. It's like, I should go pick up a 2600 and then start buying all those games I could never afford as a kid.
So I started looking on eBay to regain my old 2600 library, whatever. And in my searching, I found the Stella List. The Stella List was a collection of programmers that were interested in programming the VCS.
I think everybody who got into homebrew pretty early in the 2600 was a member of the Stella List, and that's where everybody shared their findings on the 2600. And of course, the original developer documentation that was at Atari was scanned and provided through the list. A lot of source code for demos, like audio demos, sprite demos, playfield demos, and all stuff kind of passed through the Stella mailing list.
That was where all the activity was for development for a long time before forums really came along.
Ever I needed help or if I had a problem, the team on the Stella List were there to help me get past my problems.
And it was almost all this technical discussion on how to develop for the Atari 2600, picking apart the machine and learning, the internals, because the 2600 is a very arcane machine and difficult to develop for.
It feels like it took me a year just to understand how to get playfield graphics on the screen.
And there's always new people coming into the hobby wanting to learn how to program. So yeah, it's been amazing to watch, and there's just so much development, hardware and software, on all these platforms on Atari Age.
In my mind, 2600 programming is as raw as it gets. It kind of shows people all your flaws. And so I'm really nervous about sharing things on the Atari Age forums. I have in the past, and I've received some great feedback, but ultimately at the end of the day, for me, I feel so inadequate when I post things there, because there's so many smart people who are way smarter than me, doing just incredible things, and I always feel like what I'm posting is just like a friend of mine used to say, it feels baby school.
But on the Atari Age forum, they have a 2600 programmer forum that you can go to. Yeah, anyone is willing to just jump in and help you.
There's a number of really talented programmers still doing wonders on the 2600.
That part of the Stella List lives on the Atari Age forum. Absolutely.
When we started Atari Age, back in 2000, we worked on 2000, opened it in 2001. Atari really wasn't paying attention to this growing community of people who are basically celebrating the brand.
I don't think there was any time during those years when homebrew really started to take off for the Atari consoles that Atari at that time felt in any way threatened.
I don't think they knew we existed. and I don't think they cared. I just don't think they cared.
I think most of the time they just kind of ignored it.
But Adventure 2, when it started out, was not endorsed by Atari in any way. And when they got wind of it, it came very close to shutting the project down. But they were able to work together, and now it is an IP that is approved by Atari, and now the community, they can play it. I mean, it was a great piece of work.
At some point, I realized, well, Atari Age, costs money to run. It's running on like a dedicated server with the forum and the games database. We can, instead of having ads on the website, we can just start publishing games ourselves. So it just went really slowly first, and one of the first games was Mike Micah's Berserk voice enhanced.
And ultimately, it was the information I gathered from shared resources in the homebrew community that led me to adapt Berserk's voice.
And from there, it just kind of blossomed, and a small group of home developers, including Thomas Jentz, allowed me to start publishing their games in the Atari Age store.
Kurt Bendel was working with Atari and did the first flashback. It wasn't exactly what he envisioned, but it was the starting point. And that was his whole plan, as I understand it. It's like, let me get in the door with this, and then I can produce what I wanted. And that was the flashback too. In doing that and contracting with Atari, Kurt reached out to homebrew developers because he wanted to showcase, hey, not only do you have these classics here, but you have people that are still programming for this unit, and he wanted to show that. I was one of the homebrew developers that he reached out to. I'm honored that he reached out to me on that.
I had the fortune of knowing Kurt Vendel years and years ago. I met him at this trade show. Well, it was like a fan show called World of Atari, and it was in '98, I believe. And it was pretty clear he knew a lot about Atari. And not only that, he had a lot of ephemera from the old Atari days. And so we became fast friends. And a lot of the early Digital Eclipse projects that we worked on, Kurt helped us out, and he found the information we needed. He helped us figure out how things worked. He was an incredible hardware guy, incredible software guy, and he was so hell-bent on getting the story right. And so I give a lot of credit to Kurt for paving the way, for giving people the understanding of like where the real heroes were in those old days at Atari.
lot of games were in development at Atari when the market crashed in '94, and a lot of them were done or very close to being done, and not just for the 2600, but also the 5200. A lot of these prototypes are being discovered during this time period, and there were various people who were creating packaging for them that would be reminiscent of, hey, what if Atari published it? What if Fox published this game? What would it look like? And you'd have a line of people at the Classic Gaming Expo on Saturday or Sunday to get their copy of the game, and they would sell out back then. And, they're $50, $60 a piece, but, they look great. They look like this is what real sports basketball we never released, but, there's a really nice community-produced reproduction of it. They come from all over. Sometimes they come from the original developers who were working at Atari, took copies of those with them, thankfully, before they were thrown out. And they were nice enough to they either sell them or loan them out so people can actually dump them and then, preserve them indefinitely. And then Atari sent out a lot of lab loaner carts, basically like cartridges of games that were going to be released, like sending them to magazines in advance. Especially magazines back then had a really long lead time of months. So you'd want to get those games to the magazines so they could test them and then have an article ready, by the time the game comes out. So that's where a lot of the cartridges come from. They had a unique lab loaner label, returned to somebody at Atari with the name handwritten on the label. I'm sure you've seen them. Even now, there's still prototypes being unearthed, which is just remarkable that so long, after all this time has passed, we're still finding new games that either we never knew about or knew about and just didn't think existed. But people are finding them still. when you think of the 80s and video games, Atari is the company that comes to mind. And because those people grew up with, there's a lot of nostalgia today still for the brand, and I think that's the main reason why you see people so passionate about Atari.
When we do our best, video games are an art form. What we're doing doesn't just distract people or pass the time. We leave them with something.
The brand was so iconic for so long that it feels like it was a part of their life, and that it felt like a part of their identity. So I think whenever Atari over the years has done something against those core values of what people have brought to Atari and how they feel they fit with Atari, that's why you'd see a lot of vocal retaliation to what Atari was doing, because it was so personal to them.
And Atari did a great job with marketing. They had a lot of the arcade hits, like Pac-Man and Defender, and just tons of arcade games that people wanted to play at home. And they just did a great job with marketing, getting the systems out there, and that's what people remember from those early days.
For me, it is the excitement that I had as a young teenager having the VCS. That excitement is still there for me. And you've heard this before, you never forget your first love. That would be the VCS for me.
I think video games are proving to be more and more like the music business. Whatever you heard at certain points in your life of music, that's the soundtrack for your life. And when you hear those songs, when you were a kid or when you were a teen or when you were in college, it brings back those memories, and you're attached to that time and to that version of yourself, and the music takes you back there.
I think for a lot of people, it was the very first system that they had, especially for the 2600. And even then, the Pong systems that came before that, and Atari was active in arcades as well. I think the combination of the home consoles, arcades, and then computers, that kind of trifecta really kept Atari in everyone's minds, versus the other companies only had like a console, home console, and didn't do the other things.
I took my 8-bit 800XL with me to college, and that's what I wrote my reports on. Now, granted, everybody in the dorm down the hall heard it pecking on the, the 1027, but hey, I did my reports on it.
There were people who dedicated their lives to just making sure that an Atari 800 could stay working. And they would sell parts as cheap as they could to people to keep their machines working. And so for, I'd say like 3 decades, basically you've had all these kind of like unknown people working behind the scenes just to keep Atari alive.
Millions of people grew up with these consoles. They enjoyed them. Their first interaction with video games for a lot of people, and computers. And, and Atari made a ton of great arcade games as well that are very memorable. So again, I think all of that just helped to keep the brand alive, even when Atari wasn't very active.
Ultimately, I think Atari, the name, was what survived, but not Atari, the game company. It was a different game company. It was really just Atari by name. And so we were left with a huge community of people who grew up with the Atari. It was a very personal thing for them that felt like they were being abandoned by the namesake in some ways. And so they were the ones who were the torchbearers. These are people who kept Atari alive.
I was in Europe, in Germany, and I was waiting for some friends, and all of a sudden this person comes walking by in a bright green, Kelly green shirt with a white Atari across it. And then later on, I was at the Gap store at Christmas time, and I saw a multicolored Atari t-shirt for children, and I said, well, I kind of chuckled to myself, and I said, Jesus, Atari is just not going to go away. And then, of course, I had to buy the shirt for my great nephew. So